Hello, today we're going to be going over the 2021 January-February Lincoln Douglas debate topic, which states resolved, states ought to ban lethal autonomous weapons. Now, as a quick aside before we actually get into the resolution itself, I do debate in a very traditional circuit myself on the high school level. As a result, obviously arguments are going to be different debate based off what type of debate you're doing. So, for instance, debating myself in Missouri, I'm going to have a very conservative pool of judges, which is obviously going to change your argumentation than, say, if you're debating in California. And beyond that, as you move to certain different areas of the country, or even as you move into areas of college debate, you're going to see a lot more highly technical arguments, be it just simply more complicated on the contention level, or having to do with greater concepts such as theory and topicality and decay, all of which are going to actually change what type of arguments you can feasibly run under each topic, especially in a topic like this, in which I think you're going to see a lot of different topicality arguments ran. But on that note, I'm not going to really delve into those within this topic, as it is more based for people who debate in a traditional circuit. And as I stated before, there are some arguments which I have specifically picked because I think they can do well with largely conservative judges. But for the most part, these are pretty universal to most pools of judges, as long as we're assuming that they don't have much experience with debate itself. But on that note, without further ado, let's actually get into the topic analysis itself and hopefully keep this video pretty short. So here's what we're going to go through very quickly. We're going to first define the terms in the resolution. That way we can kind of understand what the resolution is really asking of us, as obviously if you don't know what a lethal autonomous weapon is, you don't know what to expect and won't understand any of these arguments. After that, we're just going to go to a bit of background information. There's really not too much to talk about on this topic once you understand, because there's not a whole lot that has actually gone on with the topic itself and lethal autonomous weapons. And this topic is more largely going to be based off of the future and what can happen, which of course is going to be based off the contention level and what each argument or side is arguing for. And then, of course, the most important thing of this topic analysis is we will be getting into the affirmative and negative arguments that each side can run. So first, looking at this resolution and what the words actually mean. So obviously there are a couple things to take note here. Nearly everything in this resolution can be defined, although I think much of it is largely unnecessary. But it's still important to know these terms before we go into debate. So first, looking at states, obviously this one seems pretty self-explanatory for people, but there's a couple things to take note of here. First is that obviously whenever we talk about states, we're not talking about it as a United States level, as in, such as Kentucky or Maine. Those aren't the types of states we're talking about, which is a pretty well given in debate, but it's still important to point out sometimes. But beyond that, the thing that I've seen with resolutions that are worded this way, such as the one we had in January, February last year, which was about nuclear weapons and how states ought to abolish their arsenals, some people are going to try and run arguments based off of only a select sample of states. The word states in the use of this sentence is what is called a bare plural. Due to the fact that it does not say all states, technically an argument can be made that it simply means any number of states that is greater than 0 or 1. Of course, in a debate mindset, this is incredibly abusive and it is not what the resolution is actually asking of us. It's asking for all states to ban lethal autonomous weapons. But it's important to be aware of this technicality due to the fact that there is a chance that people are going to run it. As I've already stated, I've seen it be done in the past. I would not recommend it in any way, shape, or form myself, but let's keep that in mind as we look towards the arguments and try and see what specific things people might say in response. Next, moving on to the word ought. If you do not know how to define ought within a debate case and you have been doing LD for any amount of time, it's something that you definitely need to get a hold of. But of course, the thing that is always important here is that it has to do with moral obligations as opposed to other debates, which can be more consequentialist by nature. We have more options that we can take here based off of how we set up our value and value criterion, which of course is just inherent to Lincoln-Douglas debate as a whole. Moving on to ban. Once again, this one is very simple, but as you can see from my little side note there, the issue here is going to come down to how people are going to define it and think that they can run tricky arguments. Of course, what the resolution is actually asking of us is, would the world be better if all countries decided not to produce lethal autonomous weapons? However, the word ban technically does just have this connotation of making illegal to a general audience, and an argument could be made that the term ban is going to apply only to citizens of countries, not the governments themselves. Of course, once again, this is abusive, and I don't think it's going to really fly in any type of debate, except for maybe a really squirrely one if you do debate on the national circuit. But in a more traditional area, it's going to be a really poor argument, but one that I can still potentially see being ran. Next, moving on to the actual big term of this debate and what is going to be the most important concept, naturally, is lethal autonomous weapons. The definition here is going to greatly change the bounds of the debate. In fact, there's been a couple of classifications of lethal autonomous weapons that people have brought up that are a little out there and I would never have thought of, but can definitely change the grounds of the debate. For instance, I've had fellow colleagues point out that landmines could potentially be a lethal autonomous weapon. It's definitely a gray area overall, and it's all going to depend upon how you define it. A term that I commonly see on definitions of lethal autonomous weapons that I think is going to be important for the affirmative side is the ability to seek out targets. This would naturally get rid of things such as landmines, or generally anything that is just preset to go to a place and do a specific task, such as a drone that drops a bomb, because it's not actually seeking out a target. It's simply following its exact instructions to go there and do this specific thing, regardless of whether or not there's actual movement or any life there at that point. So I think that's definitely going to help the affirmative side, as it's going to limit the amount of war arguments that the negative side can bring up, such as how it's going to help the war effort or reduce casualties or anything of that effect, because we still have the ability to have some somewhat autonomous, not done completely human warfare without having completely lethal autonomous weapons. On that note, let's move on to some background information. We kind of already just touched upon it a little bit while discussing lethal autonomous weapons, but let's get into actual specific points. We don't have too much to talk about here, as most of it, as I've already stated, is going to come under the contentions, so there's not a whole lot to know. We already talked about how we define lethal autonomous weapons is going to really change what is actually important on this debate. I fear that there's going to be a lot of definition debates where both sides are going to provide a definition, and the debate is going to come down to which definition is thought to be correct. I personally hate that, and I would, for nothing else than the spirit of debate, would discourage anyone on the negative side from trying to propose a definition unless the affirmative definition is clearly abusive. And I would also oppose anyone on the affirmative side trying to produce one of these squirrely definitions that can specifically help their side. I think, of course, there is a place in debate to be strategic with your definitions and make sure that it's not too far encompassing or not too hyper-specific. But beyond that, I think it simply takes away from the nature of debate to try and win based off how you define your terms instead of how you present your ideas and what arguments you are actually presenting. So on that note, I think that you should really only have the definition in order to prevent your opponent from running arguments that are going to put you in an unfavorable situation. Now, moving on to how people are generally feeling about lethal autonomous weapons, immediately there's a lot of countries that generally don't support a ban on lethal autonomous weapons. As we can see from our list right here, Australia, France, Israel, North Korea, Russia, Turkey, the United States, and the United Kingdom, there's a lot of important states that are completely opposed to a ban and want to continue to put research into lethal autonomous weapons. And this isn't even all the countries, and these are only countries that have publicly said that they are opposed to this ban. So obviously there's a lot of support for lethal autonomous weapons. In contrast, the only country that really matters that has openly said that they support a ban on lethal autonomous weapons is China. Now, there are other countries that have supported that ban, but they don't hold a whole bunch of weight in the global community. It's countries such as Djibouti, and what Djibouti's opinion is isn't really going to hold a lot of weight, both on the global stage and also, of course, within the grounds of our debate. We're going to have a lot of evidence of countries that present their arguments for why we should have lethal autonomous weapons, which is going to be a great starting point after this topic analysis for places where you can go find deeper arguments or even perhaps some evidence behind their papers to support it or whatever arguments they might provide. Otherwise, just a fun little bit of background information. I put this in there specifically for the kids that I teach Lincoln Douglas debate to. But when I first heard about lethal autonomous weapons, of course, I knew what they were before this topic came out, but I just kind of thought that they were mainly stationary. I had heard about there's some on the Korean border between North and South Korea, which would shoot on sight any motion that it detects. But the fact that they can fly and drive and run, this one is particularly terrifying. Definitely changes their actual abilities. And obviously, while we have this little fun little banter here about how this is incredibly scary, it does also make them a lot more efficient and change what they're going to be able to do within the debate as well. So I think it's definitely important to know that lethal autonomous weapons aren't these stationary things, as silly as that might seem. So moving on to, of course, the most important thing in today's debate, most important thing in today's debate. Wow, there's my debate voice coming forward. The most important thing in topic analysis is the arguments. First, looking at the affirmative, we'll simply just have these list of arguments and go through each of them and give them a bit of an explanation about how they're actually going to work in the debate and how effective they might be, at least from my perspective. So let's first look at this idea of escalation between countries. The argument behind this is that lethal autonomous weapons are going to result in greater escalation between countries due to the fact that it's going to be much less personal and they're going to better push for these wars. Of course, whenever we have lethal autonomous weapons, there's several reasons why we can see greater escalation. Partially, it's going to be actually going in and attacking a drone is going to seem a lot less impactful than actually going in and attacking, say, a military base filled with soldiers. One of those things is going to seem a lot more doable by a country than the other. However, they're still both likely to result in greater escalation between countries. So by having the barrier set a little lower and making countries more comfortable attacking each other, that's of course just going to lead to escalation. However, the more critical one is definitely going to be miscalculation on these drones as part or whatever lethal autonomous weapon we have. Obviously, these weapons aren't going to be completely perfect. As we continue to put technology into this somewhat new concept, there's going to be a lot of errors on their part unless we have specific fail-safes, in which case, in most of those cases, you can argue that it's not truly autonomous. And whenever they make these mistakes, they're going to have very drastic consequences with rippling effects. Obviously, if a lethal autonomous weapon accidentally attacks a enemy that it isn't ordered to, then those enemies are going to respond, which can generally lead to greater conflict between nations and, of course, an escalation to war. And naturally, whenever we talk about escalating war between two countries within debate, many people are going to connect that back to nuclear warfare. I personally think that nuclear warfare arguments are generally somewhat ineffective in debate. Obviously, they're high impact arguments, but I think they have a very low probability due to the fact that these countries haven't done it in the past 80 years or so since the first nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it seems very unlikely that they're actually going to do it in the future, especially whenever we have seen countries attack that have nuclear weapons, such as the United Kingdom and I want to say the Falklands. That's where they were attacked, I believe. Regardless, there are definitely examples, and I think this nuclear escalation argument is somewhat ineffective. But either way, we're still going to see general escalation. And I think that is a very effective argument because then you can simply connect it back to obviously civilian and soldier deaths, which is a very tangible impact and very good for a utilitarian framework or really any consequentialism based framework. Moving on to the next argument is the arms race. I think this one can also kind of be tied back to a utilitarian framework, but you could also definitely put this one on a more Kantian deontological framework, saying that the arms race is wrong. Warranting out the basic idea behind this argument is the fact that whenever a country produces lethal autonomous weapons, obviously the other countries are going to struggle to keep up, and they're going to try and make sure that they're on equal footing with whatever country does. For instance, an easy example is if the United States produces lethal autonomous weapons, then Russia is going to do everything in their power to match that. That way they can feel like they're not behind us, which is a side effect and recurring symptom that has obviously been going on since the Cold War. And this arms race just generally isn't good because it leads to heightened tensions between countries. Once again, obviously looking towards the Cold War, it arguably started with a simple arms race towards nuclear weapons, with the United States having them and explicitly trying to stop the Soviet Union from being able to produce them. That obviously there are general tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union due to things such as capitalism versus communism, but the arms race was at really part of what was at the heart of that conflict. It's something that we're going to see continue not only between those two nations, but between other groups of states if we produce lethal autonomous weapons. So a ban against it would help reduce this arms race. Moving on to more civilian deaths slash just general abuse. This goes back to what we were talking about partially with escalation, but simply the fact that it's a lot easier to justify doing terrible things with lethal autonomous weapons because it's not an actual person who is pulling the trigger. Of course, beyond this, it's generally going to dehumanize people and make it feel less personal anyway. It's a lot easier to commit some heinous act and kill a large group of civilians if the person is just sending out a drone to do it and isn't actually having to do it themselves. That's a general idea here. I personally don't think that this argument is overly strong because I think there's a really strong turn that we can use to talk about how lethal autonomous weapons will actually reduce abuse, which we will then talk about on the negative side. But I think you're really just setting yourself up for a case turn that is going to harm you in the long run, unless you can find really strong evidence that like lethal autonomous weapons are going to lead to a general abuse of power and weaponry. Oops. So next, moving on to the general idea of drones. Obviously, we've been using drones as a great example of possible lethal autonomous weapons in the future, but there's just general arguments that it's going to lead to more drone strikes, which is certainly true, I guess, but I just think there's so many drone strikes right now that it's really non-unique to say that banning lethal autonomous weapons is going to have any effect because drone strikes are going to continue whether or not those drones are manned or not. So I think the effectiveness of that argument is essentially null. I just have seen briefs cover that argument in their reports, and I definitely think it's important to bring up, especially because now you are provided with a great argument for it. It's completely non-unique, and neither side solves for the issue. So another argument that people have been making against lethal autonomous weapons is that they're going to be incredibly expensive. Now, I've also heard reports that they're a lot less expensive than you'd think, and you could get a decent number for it for about, I think it was 1% of what we spend on the defense budget as the United States. Of course, the United States spends a lot on defense anyway, so that's not saying a whole lot. But being able to produce a decent number of these for relatively cheap actually shows that's not that big of a deal. But I'm sure you could still bring up absurd numbers for how much you can spend on it, as of course, since we don't have them yet, there's going to be a lot of varying claims. And the main impact of this is that obviously we're going to have to continue to not put funding in things that are important for society, such as greater welfare states or whatever argument you want to try and use, education. It doesn't really matter what actually you're going to talk about. Just make sure you have a really good impact of where the money could better be used. And you could also talk about like the United States specifically hyperfixation on the military and how that comes at the cost of other groups. I think this argument is like not very good. I think there's definitely a case to be made, but I just think there's a lot more high impact arguments that you could be using. The military industrial complex is an interesting argument to me. This one definitely is more of a Kantian one, but it talks about how we're continuing to make the military part of all aspects of life. Now, as a high school student, I'm definitely used to things such as recruiters coming and just hanging around the school for some reason, trying to recruit kids, which is something that obviously is pretty commonplace in American society at this point in time, which is an effect of the military industrial complex having greater control over our society as a whole. I don't really think that there's a super big link here between the lethal autonomous weapons and the military industrial complex. That's my biggest issue with this argument. I think there's definitely a case to be made about how this can better make war. It's going to seem less negative and almost more like a game, which is going to go with that dehumanizing and desensitizing people to war argument that we have down there. But as people become less adverse to war, of course, the effect of the military and their influence over us is going to spread more and more throughout our society. And just talk about having the military have such great influence over our lives, of course, is not going to be the most Kantian idea. As you could talk about how like the military uses people as a means to an end. I think you could definitely find someone who can provide you with a lot greater evidence and explanation of that and make that argument work. But definitely also as a consequentialist myself, both within debate generally and as a general person, it simply doesn't have a super wide appeal to me. Next, we could talk about how this is going to undermine third world countries. As it says right there, I think it's non-unique, and we'll go into why. So obviously, as we already talked about, lethal autonomous weapons are somewhat expensive. And we're clearly not going to see third world countries have the ability to produce these weapons. So the argument here is that they're going to be very short. They're not going to have the ability to combat other nations that have lethal autonomous weapons. They simply won't. My issue with this is that they don't have the power to battle those countries now. If the United States decides that they want to go into Africa and start a war with these tiny countries, regardless of whether or not they have lethal autonomous weapons, they're probably going to win. And there's going to be nothing that that country can generally do to stop them. So regardless, yes, countries aren't going to be able to afford them, but it's largely going to it's not going to cause a greater undermining of these people because they were simply already at a disadvantage. In fact, one could make an argument that they now have a greater advantage because their lack of numbers, such as the Israeli army, which is pretty small, even though they force a lot of people to go into it. They now have this supplement because they don't actually need people to man these drones. So you could make a turn there. I just think that third world countries aren't going to be a super great argument on either side. But once again, I have seen it in the brief, so we'll bring it up. This is, I think, is a really big one. The desensitizing people to war. Obviously, we've touched upon this already several times because it is kind of linked to other arguments. But whenever you're not actually having to actively pull the trigger to take people's lives, you're going to have a more willingness to cause these heinous acts. So obviously, as we continue to do this more and more over time, and we've even heard people make jokes about how it's it's just like video games, which is kind of scary whenever you think about the fact that people aren't really taking war seriously anymore. And it's going to continue to get to that point if we have lethal autonomous weapons. And my issue here is that we really don't have tangible impacts. We can definitely say that's going to lead to greater conflict because people are less adverse to war, which once again kind of goes back with that escalation argument, but on a different format. But that's a lot less tangible than how if we do it with escalation, because it's like, it kind of could happen, and like the link is a lot weaker, and even then we're kind of going to be pressed to find like any specific numbers. And obviously you don't need like a specific number inherently for consequentialism and those types of arguments, but it makes it a lot stronger, right? So I think this one has a really good concept. I think if you could find good evidence to support it, it can be really strong. But I think this is going to be one that you have to put a lot of effort into pulling off. And this last one intrigues me a lot because I think it can be super strong if, once again, we can simply find the evidence that it's feasible. That's the issue of cybersecurity. Um, Obviously, these are probably going to be hackable in some way. Some people have been making arguments that it's going to be used only on old technology, such as like floppy disks, due to the fact that that is what a lot of like the nuclear arsenals are set up with. But I find this hard to believe for two main reasons. One, the reason that the nuclear arsenals are built up on floppy disks is due to the fact that that's the type of technology that was had when they were created. So obviously, they're going to simply not update their technology if it's going to prevent hacking because it already works in the current system that it uses. But two, specifically, I don't think that these lethal autonomous weapons are going to be effective without some way for an outside like actor to communicate with them and change their programming or even like intervene with what they're doing. Obviously, they have the ability to be fully autonomous, but without a way to connect some outside source and change its programming, I don't think they're going to be overly useful for us. Even if it's something as simple as having a camera and we can see through their eyes. So if we have that ability, of course, that's also going to mean that it is hackable. And now it might seem like this is something that simply won't actually happen, and it's like, oh, why? It's possible, but it's really unfeasible. But the United States is famous for hacking into North Korea's missile systems, so obviously, nuclear missile systems specifically, and causing test failures. So if we're able to do it with those types of countries and their weak cybersecurity, then it's likely that, let's say, North Korea then produces lethal autonomous weapons. They're probably not going to have great cybersecurity on those either. And then, be it other state actors or simply non-state actors, such as terrorist organizations, if they have the ability to hack into these lethal autonomous weapons, obviously that's going to have horrible ripple effects on society, and it's going to pose a great threat to many lives. So obviously, once again, finding the evidence for this is going to be rough. A, that they're going to be hackable in like theory at all. B, that they're likely going to be hacked. And then C, actually proving that actors, be them state-based or otherwise, are going to have the ability, and then what the impact is going to be. There's a lot of components that you have to bring together to make this argument work, but I think it's a really strong one. Like I said, it's very interesting to me, and I'm curious to see how it works, and honestly, just what evidence I'm personally able to come up with and what the briefs are going to be able to come up with. Looking at this list of arguments, I personally like escalation a lot, cybersecurity a lot. The desensitizes people to war. Like I said, it's good, especially depending on what type of framework you're using. Those personally are the ones that are strongest to me. There's definitely more we can add to this list, especially with new briefs coming out. When I made this list, the GDS briefs weren't out, and they're a great one. A lot of the people on that staff are very talented. I'm sure they're going to have a unique spin on some of these arguments. So there's definitely a lot more we can do, but right off the bat, those are the ones that seem strong to me. Next, let's quickly move on to the negative arguments. There's going to be a lot less of them. So just hopping straight into it, we can look at general national security for nations. Obviously, the argument is that it's going to be lethal autonomous weapons are going to just lead to less escalation and less war and just general greater security for people. I don't think that this one is overly strong, because I believe the escalation arguments are generally better on the affirmative side, and that we're going to see more escalation because people are going to be less adverse to attacking lethal autonomous weapons. But one could also argue that's actually going to lead to less escalation and therefore less war and therefore greater national security. There's really not too much more to be said about that because we've kind of already delved into the idea of more or less war and more or less death. And it's going to be the same thing, but simply reversed. Moving on to the less room for error, this one is one that I'm definitely intrigued by and I kind of want to use. But you could argue that obviously a more objective uh, like robot that doesn't have the ability to have such as like emotional irrational decisions in war is going to lead to a lot less errors, and it's going to be a lot more cool and calculated within like tense situations. I also think that you could argue, of course, that the fact that humans have a moral compass and they can go against orders that they believe are immoral are, of course, going to kind of be a nice turn to this argument, saying, well, yes, they might not produce errors with, as in like doing what not doing what they're told, but they're still going to be doing things that are morally wrong. I think this argument is I think there's going to be evidence to support it, but I don't think the impacts are going to be very strong because these errors, quote unquote, made by humans are generally probably going to be for the better. Of course, the most basic argument for this topic is going to be the less death in war, which is honestly a strong one. I just know that people are going to be obviously prepping it out. But the general idea behind it is that if we have lethal autonomous weapons actually doing the fighting instead of humans, then obviously we're going to have a lot less casualties among soldiers between two armies. Excuse me. So that's a pretty basic argument on that point. Obviously, the impact is less death. There's not too much more to say on that. Now, this next one I really actually like, and I think I'm personally going to run this one on my case. But it's going to be the fact that we can see less war crimes if we have lethal autonomous weapons. For those of you that don't know, there's a lot of bad things that go on overseas due to soldiers simply doing things they're not supposed to. As we put in parentheses, a lot of it is rape. It's awful. But if we have lethal autonomous weapons, then obviously there's not going to be rape. They don't have the ability to do that, which is definitely good for society. We should definitely be not promoting war crimes, or even simply reducing things like civilian casualties. Now, of course, once again, you could talk about there's going to be more civilian casualties because lethal autonomous weapons aren't going to be able to gauge what is right or wrong, and sometimes they'll just kill indiscriminately. So there are some case turns that you can use here, but I just think generally it's a less like basic argument that there's going to be a lot less prep out for, but I still think it's just as strong. Also, how do you outweigh rape? Like, it's one of those things that it's like with racial discrimination. Like, there's no way anyone can come up and say, well, my thing is more important than stopping people from getting raped. It's like, if you do that, I will probably vote you down as a judge. So that's also part of the reason why I like that argument. This next one I don't like because I think I think it's non-topical because I think in Lincoln Douglas debate you shouldn't have to actually argue about the feasibility of an argument. It's a debate of morals, and it's only if something is morally right or wrong. But of course, there's going to be the argument that people aren't actually going to listen to the ban, and they're going to continue to make lethal autonomous weapons, and then countries like the United States that follow the ban are going to be disadvantaged. Which, yeah, it would be true on an actual policy standpoint, but I just think generally it doesn't apply. Of course, then they also talk about how it's like, oh, the United States is going to be disadvantaged because now they're going to be behind, but also if the technology exists, obviously the United States is simply just going to work at producing it at that point. So even then, it's like I don't think that argument is overly strong. But as with nuclear weapons, I saw it was used, and I know it's going to be used again for better or for worse. And of course, lastly, we've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but there's going to be some de-escalation due to situations with lethal autonomous weapons. And the reasoning behind this is that it feels like a lot less personal attack if your lethal autonomous weapon is attacked than it is if like an actual human being is attacked. If a drone is shot down in the air, then it's a lot more likely that countries are simply going to let it go without going to war due to the fact that obviously war is bad and they're just going to decide that it's not worth it. However, especially from a political standpoint, if soldiers are killed, generally people are going to want to get revenge for that act. I mean, even look at the United States, there's been a lot of criticism towards President Trump for not doing anything about the bounties that Russia put on soldiers' heads. So obviously, whenever these like soldiers are attacked, the citizens generally take it as a like personal attack on their country and something that they need to respond to right away. But a drone being destroyed, regardless of how expensive it is, isn't going to invoke that same type of response, and people are generally going to be more okay with letting it slide. So obviously, the argument there is that it's going to lead to less war overall, and situations are actually going to de-escalate. I also like this argument a lot, honestly. I think this one and just generally the rape and less death in war argument are really good. And I think a couple of these are going to be what I use. Maybe I'll even have multiple neg cases to use them all based off what is effective and what the AF is. I generally think that the negative side has a lot more ground here. But I generally also think that I can be wrong sometimes going into these debates, and once you actually start debating it and writing your cases, you'll see that maybe it's a lot more balanced than you think. So, but anyway, that's all I have for you guys today. Once again, these are just general arguments that I personally think will be run. And it's important to know, but of course, go conduct your own research, go read the briefs, go see what they all think is important, because there's a lot more information out there that I haven't covered in today's video. Additionally, if more arguments come out that I believe are important, we might go over it in a separate kind of mini analysis, or even just simply analyzing, such as like the cases that I write. So just make sure that you go through and don't become too hyperfixated on these arguments, because otherwise you might be blindsided by a bizarre affirmative in like your first round of this topic, and we'll get off to a bad start with the January, February topic. So, but of course, use this to get a basic idea of where we should go from here, get good cases written, and we'll see how it goes once we actually start debating in January and February. But thank you guys for watching, and I hope you good luck.